Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I know I have been away for a long time, but thank you for sticking around and for the positive response to my videos. I'm now back and here to stay. A lot of you have shown interest in volume spread analysis, so I am going to create a multi-part video series on this topic. I have extensively used volume spread analysis, so I'm also going to share my personal experience with using VSA. In this first video, I'll take you through the basics of volume spread analysis. I will also address misconceptions surrounding this analysis technique. Then in the upcoming videos, I will separately cover the signs of strength and signs of weakness. So let's not waste any more time and dive right into volume spread analysis. Welcome back guys. So what is VSA or volume spread analysis? It's a powerful technical analysis technique that is about looking at volume and price action together to figure out what the big money or smart money is up to. You know, the smart money always moves the market, so if you can decipher their moves, you can know their intentions and align your trades with them. But before we dig deeper into volume spread analysis, questions like how the volume and price action relate to each other and how they link to smart money need to be addressed. Well, think of volume as the heartbeat of the market. It beats with every price movement and reveals the market's strength. On the other hand, price action relates to the struggle between the buyers and the sellers. So if the price and volume move in the same direction, it's obvious that the big players have a consensus about the market direction. And when they do not sync together or move in the opposite direction, it simply indicates an indecision period, which often leads to a potential price change. So the idea is to pre-process the changes in volume and price and place our trades accordingly. Now let's clear a common misconception. When we talk about spread in VSA, it's not the bid and ask spread. Instead, the spread here is all about the price range in a given time frame. Let's say a stock price opens at $50. It makes a high of $55, then drops to a low of $49 and finally closes at $54. So the spread for the day is the distance between $55 and $49, which is the opening and closing prices. This spread reveals the struggle between the market forces, and we analyze this spread with the corresponding volume. Now let's have a look at VSA's application across different markets. Originally, VSA was used in the stock markets. The stock market structure allows a clear observation of the volume and price action. So for the stock markets, VSA is an ultimate choice because the volume data is readily available. The same goes for the future and commodity markets, where volume data is also accurate and readily available. But what about Forex and crypto markets? As we know, these markets do not have centralized exchanges, which means volume data is somewhat less reliable. But you know, these markets have the tick volume, and that is a proxy to the real volume. So in my view, you can analyze the Forex and crypto market using the tick volume and get the same results. Now the big question is, what are the time frames and trading styles volume spread analysis is suited for? Once again, based on my experience, volume spread analysis is not just a one-size-fits-all tool. Its application varies significantly across different time frames and trading styles. My experience tells me it's best suited for long-term and mid-term investment strategies. It is because with a bigger time frame, you can peel back multiple layers of market activity and reveal the smart money trends. With short-term trading styles, especially scalping, it's probably not going to work at all. For other trading styles such as day trading, I always urge to adopt a second layer of confirmation with VSA. Finally, how do you start analyzing the markets using the volume spread analysis? Well, I'm going to make it overly simple for you by saying we simply look for the signs of strength and signs of weakness. Signs of strength indicate the buyers are controlling the market and the price is likely to rise. Whereas the signs of weakness indicate that sellers are dominating the market and the price is likely to drop. So based on these signs of strength and weakness, we take our positions accordingly. Hopefully now you understand the basics of volume spread analysis. In my next video, I'll take you through the signs of strength. If you found value in this video, please don't forget to hit the like button. Also subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications to stay updated on all my future videos.